Well, hello everyone, and welcome to today's closing keynote on the importance of Google Analytics 4 in the expectations economy. My name is Nick Iyengar. I'm a Vice President of Analytics here at Merkle Cardinal Path, and I hope you've been enjoying the conference so far. What we're going to cover today in this session is basically an overview of how is Google Analytics 4 going to equip us as marketers and as analytics professionals to continue to provide data-driven optimization for marketing in the face of a lot of interesting challenges and trends that have been unfolding that are making measurement and analytics more difficult. So let's take a quick look at what we're going to cover in our agenda here. As you can see, we're going to focus on just a few key topics. First, we're going to start by looking at what is the expectations economy. We'll just be brief about that. I think we all know what this is in some sense and participate in it. And then we'll shift gears and talk about how, in the face of these consumer expectations, are a variety of industry changes and challenges, frankly, making measurement and optimization more challenging. So we'll talk about that in some detail, and then we'll shift gears and get a bit more specific in terms of GA4, and we'll talk about how Google Analytics 4 is specifically designed to address those challenges with specific solutions, right? So we'll cover that in some detail, and then we'll bring it down to ground level and really talk about some specific use cases and opportunities that those solutions represent. Okay, so without further ado, let's dive right in. So we talked about the expectations economy. Again, just going to touch on this briefly here. We all know what this is. We all participate in the expectations economy in some way. But basically, the idea here is that the customer journey online was never linear. It was never simplistic, and I think we know that. However, it's also true that customer journeys are now more complex and more fragmented than ever. We interact with brands and have touch points with brands via more marketing channels than ever before, increasingly niche in many cases. And those touch points are happening across a wider and wider variety of screens, right? So no longer are we only going online on our desktop computer at home. But as we all know, right, we have computers and laptops and tablets and smartwatches and all this kind of stuff. And so the customer journey, while it was always probably more complicated than we appreciated, is even more complicated than ever. And this poses obvious challenges in terms of orchestrating a cohesive brand experience and a high-performing customer journey in the face of this challenge. At the same time, consumers expect more from brands in digital than they ever have, right? And so it's a bit of a double whammy, right? It's getting more and more difficult to manage all this stuff, and at the same time, consumers expect more. Just a few stats to rattle off here. You can see that vast majorities of consumers expect companies to personalize their experiences, right? And on top of that, consumers are also a lot more likely to recommend brands who deliver on that expectation of personalization. To boil this down, I thought it was interesting. You rarely see stats like this, like fully 90%. So basically everyone expects what is described as a seamless experience, regardless of where a touch point occurs. So what that means is, consumers don't care that something that happened within the app isn't being reflected on the web, or they don't care that that's difficult, right? But they do expect that. So they want brands to understand, okay, I'm doing this in the app, or I'm doing this on web, and therefore, my profile should be updated, or the way that you interact with me should be updated and reflect all of that, even if at some later point I'm interacting with you in a different channel, right? So that seamless experience is no longer a competitive advantage. It's no longer a differentiator for a brand. Instead, it's actually become just a baseline expectation. So if you're not delivering this, it's not so much that you're kind of in the middle of the pack. You're actually behind from a consumer expectation standpoint. And that's tricky because delivering on this expectation, like I said, is more complicated and more difficult, frankly, than it's ever been. In the face of that, there are also a wide variety of industry trends and changes and challenges, some of which have been rolling out kind of slowly and incrementally for years now, which collectively have converged to just add to this pile of challenges that we're facing. So a lot of us are familiar with these already, but let me just touch on a few. So the three that we're going to cover in some detail here are what I'm calling tectonic shifts, and you might have heard Alex Langsher in the previous session touching on this as well. So we'll talk about this. We'll talk about signal loss. And then lastly, we'll talk about privacy and compliance and regulation. And basically, all three of these are somewhat interrelated, but of course, they're worth covering individually as well. So let's start with this idea of tectonic shifts or continental drift. I really like this old chestnut about the United States and the United Kingdom, referred to as two countries separated by a common language. And it's also just sort of interesting to think about the fact that, like here in the States, the Appalachian Mountains were once, part of the same continent, the same geography as like the Scottish Highlands or the mountains in Scandinavia or even in North Africa. And basically, what's happened over time, at least this is how the theory goes, is that the continents have fractured and then drifted apart over time. And so you might be wondering, like, where is Nick going with this sort of tortured geographical, metaphor here? But actually, this really applies very directly to the kinds of changes that we're grappling with in digital and in marketing and in analytics. How is that? Well, similar to Pangea, right, the kind of meta continent that used to exist in prehistory, the open web is breaking apart as well. And it's breaking apart into some very large, global scale, kind of dominant platforms. And we all know who those are, right? Google, Meta, Amazon, and so forth. And we often refer to them in marketing and in analytics as the walled gardens. And I think that's an appropriate way to refer to them in some sense. But in another sense, it doesn't really describe the true breadth and depth and scope and size of these platforms. And so in this metaphor, we're referring to organizations like Google and Meta and Amazon as these digital continents, right? They're very large in scale. And importantly for us, they're drifting apart, right? So they're becoming further and further apart. Interoperability is becoming difficult. Data sharing is becoming difficult. And just to add to this metaphor, it's not just about the continents. We're now seeing even new kind of digital islands emerging. And so these are properties that probably don't have the size and scale of, say, like a Google or an Amazon or a Meta or an Apple, but they're important in their own right. And certainly for certain industries or certain brands, they could be very important. So what do we mean by these digital islands? We'll take a look at some of these headlines, and many of us have seen these already. But you're starting to see that basically, everything is an ad network, right? And a lot of brands that you might not think of as being, digital first or digital natives, but brands that are sitting on a lot of interesting, valuable first-party data are starting to realize, hey, we can monetize this and turn this into an entire business, right? So organizations like Kroger, Albertsons, right? Groceries as a business, you're looking at margins in the low single digits. But if you can monetize that first-party data that, for example, retail chains have, and use it to sell ads, you're looking at margins in that business that are substantially more healthy, right? And so interesting growth opportunities, even for organizations that you don't think of as being heavily invested in like digital advertising and these kinds of things. So that's the kind of new cliche that's emerging, is anyone that's got first-party data can turn into an ad network, and basically everyone is an ad network now. And so these are good examples of those digital islands. Here's a little bit of just logo soup, but I think it illustrates the point. These can be kind of verticalized or targeting certain segments of consumers, but there are lots and lots of digital islands emerging. And when you think about which ones of these are most relevant to your brand, it's probably not all of them, right? And that's okay. But by the same token, there's probably several that you're looking at here and thinking, wow, like these brands have data that would be interesting for me from a targeting standpoint, right? So how do I reach my audience, not only across the big continents, but even across these sort of archipelagos of islands, as we just play this metaphor out a little bit more. The other thing to think about is the more and more of these digital islands that emerge, the more and more fragmentation necessarily occurs in terms of trying to have a cohesive plan for reaching your audience and for measuring what's working, right? Even just basic metrics like reach and frequency and things like that become extremely difficult to manage when you've got this many islands or this many data silos, to say it another way. And so there's more fragmentation, there's more complexity than ever. And not surprisingly, as a result, there's higher costs in terms of just trying to manage this and trying to orchestrate this, right? So hopefully what you're seeing here is that consumer expectations are higher than they've ever been, and have become sort of just a baseline assumption about what brands will provide. And yet the environment that we're trying to navigate is more complicated than it has been in the past. The other thing to note is that fragmentation, this drift of the continents and the emergence of these islands, also worsens this trend that's happening in parallel that we're calling signal loss or the signal gap. And this is because basically these continents are to a certain degree in conflict with each other. And then we as brands and marketers and measurement professionals are sort of caught up in the crossfire. So we know all about things like Apple kind of constantly turning the ratchet on privacy. We know that, for example, like Google and Meta tend to not benefit, shall we say, from those changes, right? And so as that ratchet keeps getting turned on things like privacy settings and stuff like that, we begin to lose signals that perhaps in the past we took for granted, right? And so again, these continents are drifting apart. They're not collaborating with each other. They're not cooperating with each other. And then we as brands and marketers are somewhat, caught up in the collateral damage, you might say. So let's talk a little bit more about signal loss more generally. So we've covered the digital continents. We've talked about the islands and how they're drifting apart. What else is driving signal loss? Well, there are several trends. Mostly we think about cookie deprecation or the cookie apocalypse or the end of cookies. And this is kind of like a marketing cliche at this point, but there actually is a lot to cover here. And so third-party cookies support, as I'm sure you know, a wide variety of MarTech and AdTech functions. And as a result, they do get a lot of press in terms of the deprecation of third-party cookies. However, it is worth taking a slightly more nuanced view of how the loss of third-party cookies sort of undercuts or undermines these various functions. And so what you can see here is we've got a kind of simple red, yellow, green scorecard. And what you're seeing is on the right-hand side of the screen, for example, there are several kinds of functions, several capabilities in the MarTech, AdTech stack that, frankly, actually aren't that negatively impacted by the loss of third-party cookies specifically. So for example, site analytics, tools like Google Analytics, but even others like Adobe and other providers generally provide website analytics through the use of first-party cookies, right? And so there are issues with those that we'll come to in a moment. But when you think about the loss of third-party cookies specifically, you can start to see how, well, there are certain functions that actually aren't that directly impacted by this. On the other hand, there are functions and capabilities that are squarely directly impacted to the point where we even kind of question the future of this technology, right? So DMPs that are purely reliant on third-party cookies, things like cookie-based onboarding, right? Even multi-touch attribution, view-through attribution, these are all kind of squarely in the red, maybe yellow at best section of the chart. And that's because they're just more highly dependent or even totally dependent on third-party cookies. And so, the cookie apocalypse is probably something that's slightly overplayed in the press, but it is very real. And what I encourage you is just to think through this a little bit more specifically in terms of, what functions and capabilities are important to me, and how does the loss of third-party cookies impact them. But no matter where you are or what brand you're working with, you're going to feel the impact of this to at least some extent. But like I said, it's not just about third-party cookies. We tend to overlook certain other trends that don't quite get as much press for whatever reason, possibly because they're slightly harder to measure. We talked about website analytics in the previous slide and how, hey, these are based on first-party cookies. So good news, you're in the green, right? Less risk. But is that really true, right? So just because there's not a direct challenge from third-party cookies doesn't mean that there's no risk at all in terms of signal loss and data loss. So I like this chart here. What this is measuring for you is just the growth in monthly active users of the Brave browser. And if you're not familiar with Brave, it is still a bit of a niche product, but what it is it's a browser that is specifically focused on privacy, right? So a lot of settings that maybe you'd have to opt into using a more kind of mainstream or common browser, if you like, that are enabled by default in Brave. And as you can see here, the growth has been really, really rapid. So we don't have the numbers for 2022 just yet, as we've only just closed the books. But what you can see is that Brave's growth is basically doubling every year, or at least roughly speaking. And what that speaks to is actually a kind of broader backdrop where the use of ad blockers, the use of tracking prevention technologies, the requirement to gain consent to be able to even do sort of basic data collection in support of analytics. These things are all on the rise. They are kind of, ironically, by their very nature, difficult to measure, right? Like how many people use ad blockers? Well, it's actually kind of hard to say. And so the numbers that you see quoted can often be sort of all over the map. But again, I like this chart just looking at the adoption of Brave as a browser because I think it, at least to some degree,
or summarizes the general trend. So what this means is, even for things like website analytics, where you're not necessarily at risk because of the loss of third-party cookies, there are other trends that are unfolding for similar reasons, right? That have a similar genesis, if you like, that actually do create a risk of data loss, or what we're calling that signal gap. Right? So I think that's interesting to consider as well. And then lastly, we should talk about maybe the elephant in the room, or the driving force behind a lot of this, which is, consumers are more privacy aware than ever. And they care a lot more. It's not just that they're aware, but they actually care about their privacy more than ever as well. And that's driving really important and really major shifts in the regulatory environment, frankly, that we're all having to operate within. And so let's talk about that a little bit more. We talked about the expectations economy, and how consumers want brands to deliver this seamless experience, regardless of channel, regardless of device. At the same time, consumers want more privacy than ever, right? And so these are interesting challenges to try to balance. And when you ask consumers kind of how they feel about these topics, it's interesting kind of how strongly these sentiments register. So, for example, it's not just that consumers want privacy. You have almost 90% of consumers in one survey here that believe that data privacy is a right. Right, so it's not just a privilege or something that they want or that they expect from brands, but they think it's a right. Similarly, you see, 80% of consumers believe that the user experience that brands provide should not be affected, or should not be made a kind of bargaining chip in terms of data collection. So we often see those cookie banners that say, oh, we want to collect data so that we can give you a personalized experience, or so that we can optimize the user experience of our app, or these kinds of things. And that's brands trying to say, hey, let us track you, essentially, because we're going to give you something valuable in returns, or in the long run. But what you're seeing is that consumers basically don't feel like their user experience should be conditional in that sense, right? So they feel like they should get that personalized experience, that seamless experience across touch points and channels, even if they opt out of data collection, right? Now we can talk about how realistic is that, but in some sense, that's what consumers want, and that's what they expect, right? And so that's also an important part of this expectations economy. So where does that leave us? Well, firstly, we know that a lot of the big tech firms have responded to this demand for privacy, right, by trying to supply that demand. And Apple, I think, is probably the most prominent example of a big tech company that's doing that. You look at all the changes they've made in terms of iOS and in terms of Safari, and these are things that really do make data collection more difficult, especially for users who are on these devices. Look at some of these other kind of technologies that maybe 5 years ago you'd barely heard of, but now are widely known and widely adopted. Consent management platforms like OneTrust, privacy-focused products like the Brave browser we talked about, or DuckDuckGo as a search engine. You look at these, and all you see is that kind of hockey stick growth, right, where they're growing really, really quickly, and it's because of this consumer demand for privacy, which is exerting a pull on brands to deliver on that expectation, right? And then, not surprisingly, the public sector is also moving to respond. Now, they don't tend to move as quickly as the private sector, of course, but what you can see here is that all over the world now, not just in major developed top 10 economies, for example, all over the world, privacy laws are coming into force, and that means that brands have to put a greater investment and take greater responsibility around their ability to manage privacy and to manage consent and compliance and all this kind of stuff. So this is happening all over the world, and then here closer to home, if you're in the States like me, we're seeing a similar effect play out, where yes, it's true that not every state has modern, up-to-date regulations on this front just yet, but at the same time, the direction of travel, so to speak, is obvious, right? And so we do have this kind of patchwork quilt where California has CCPA, but then Oregon doesn't really have anything just yet that kind of matches that, even though it's right next door. But I think the trend here is pretty obvious. And so what we're encouraging clients to do is think about analytics in the context of compliance and of regulation by taking a kind of lowest common denominator approach, or to say it perhaps a bit more clearly, go out and find what is the strictest regulation you can find in the markets where you do business, and then assume that strictest regulation is the baseline, right? Don't treat it like the exception, treat it like the assumption, even if you don't really have to. in that sense. Take the strictest regulatory environment and assume that that's the baseline that you have to operate within. And that's going to stand you in good stead as you try to manage this over the long term. Okay. And just to the extent that anyone thinks that these regulations are kind of toothless or they're a scare tactic or they're mostly for show, that's not the case. It seems like you can hardly go 24 hours anymore without seeing these laws being enforced and without seeing recognizable brands that we know and that we probably are customers of in many cases kind of being caught up in this dragnet of regulation, right? And so we're not picking on Sephora here, right? But just an example. But like I said, you can barely go one business day now without basically pulling a similar headline about some brand that's being fined non-trivial amounts of money due to inability to comply with these regulations. And so this is not just for show. This is not something that's happening somewhere far away to companies that have nothing to do with you. This is happening all over the world, here at home in the States, and it impacts organizations across every industry. So hopefully I haven't demoralized you too much just yet with all the kinds of changes and challenges that are unfolding in the industry that make measurement and analytics and data-driven optimization more difficult, because there are a lot of opportunities. And I think one of the things that we should just call out is, yes, these continents are huge. They have an incredible amount of power and leverage. But I do think it's fair to say that one continent stands alone. Now, every brand will kind of do this calculus individually, and rightfully so. But in the aggregate, on average, on the whole, I think it's fair to say that Google is the one continent that does kind of stand apart from the others. And what that means for brands is, it's really important that if you're going to have a strategy for how you grapple with at least one continent, I would argue it probably should be Google. And there are lots of reasons why. You can see some of them on the slide here. But all of these continents have a lot of signals. They have a lot of data points about your consumers and about your brand. But if you had to pick one, I'd say Google probably has the most for the reasons that you can see here on the slide. Now, the breadth and depth of the data that Google has as a digital continent means that Google, I would argue, is uniquely positioned to start to move the analytics industry forward into a future where things are anonymized, right? Where we don't have as much directly observable data as we did in the future. For example, I would argue Google is uniquely positioned to equip brands with model data, right? With data that's produced anonymously through the use of machine learning and artificial intelligence, right? To replace or complement data that's collected in more traditional ways. So what we're going to do now is shift gears and talk a bit about, what are the solutions to these challenges that Google is bringing to the table. And those are mostly being brought to market through the Google Analytics 4 measurement platform. Okay, so let's shift gears and talk a bit about, all right, there's a lot of challenges. They're pretty tall challenges. How do we start to grapple with these through the use of some emerging technologies? So we laid out a few challenges at the outset, right? So we talked about continental drift. We talked about data loss or the signal gap. We talked about privacy and regulation. What I want to do now is try to show you how for each of those challenges, GA4, Google Analytics 4, is offering you some avenues or some solutions that basically directly ladder up to the challenges that we talked about. So here what we're going to do is chat through data consolidation, data modeling, experimentation, just going back to basics and the scientific method, and then doing all this stuff in a compliant, privacy-centric way. So let's start with data consolidation. So the idea here is that I think probably a lot of you are familiar with Google Analytics, and Google Analytics is well known as the sort of market-leading, maybe point solution for website analytics, right? And I think that's probably a fair characterization of the legacy Google Analytics platform. What GA4 is doing, though, is trying to become a more business, sort of organizational-wide business intelligence platform. So what does that mean? GA4 is going to be platform agnostic, meaning if you want to collect data from websites, from microsites, from Android apps, from iOS apps, from connected kiosks, or really any other kind of digital platform that you own or operate, you're going to be able to do that in a cohesive way, right? Because you've got now a single uniform data model that applies equally to any digital platform. But it's not just about digital. And I think this is a point that really does go under the radar with Google Analytics. It's not even just about digital analytics anymore. What Google is doing is equipping you now as a brand with a variety of methods with which you can ingest first-party data from all over the business and centralize it within Google Analytics. So yes, get all that online connected data from your website and your mobile apps and all that. But then think about how can you augment that with data that's sitting in your CRM or your point of sale system or your CMS metadata or whatever it might be, because all that data can also be ingested and then centralized within Google Analytics. And what that's going to do, that idea of like consolidating as much of your first party data as possible in one place, is it's going to give you the clearest, fullest, most holistic view of your audience and of your users. And that's super important, not only because of the kind of obvious implications for better reporting, more accurate analytics and insights and that kind of stuff. I think that's probably sort of self-explanatory, but also the clearer a picture you have of your user, again, in this era of data fragmentation and continental drift, the more impactful activations you're going to be able to put into market for those audiences. So as you build that clearer picture of the audience in Google Analytics, you'll then be able to take that audience, send it out to the various activation platforms in the Google stack. So think about the media buying platforms, the optimization platforms for your own website and that sort of thing. And those activations that you put in market are going to be a lot more powerful and a lot more positively impactful. Also, if you want to do some more advanced analytics work in places like Google Cloud or BigQuery specifically, again, the more accurate data you have, the more complete data set you have to work with, modeling is garbage in, garbage out, right? So the higher quality input you can provide to things like propensity scoring models or customer clustering algorithms or whatever your kind of more custom analytics use cases are, the higher quality and more impactful output you're going to get from all of that work. So I think that's really exciting, this idea that you can consolidate your data within Google Analytics for the purpose of more kind of impactful, higher performing activations in the market. Okay, so next, let's talk about data modeling. This is a really big topic. We could easily do a full hour just on data modeling itself, but at least let's do it justice here with a few minutes to give at minimum a good overview. So data modeling is the idea that we no longer have this ability to directly observe as much data as we could in the past. And as a result, if we don't directly collect that data, for example, because a user hasn't consented, we would, in theory, just be left with a gap, with a sort of black hole, right? Where there was data in the past, there would now be no data at all. And obviously, as analytics professionals and as marketers, that's not a situation that we want to be in. However, through the use of data modeling, we now have an opportunity to basically avoid that black hole situation and instead replace data that otherwise would be lost with modeled data that's produced through machine learning. And so a good example of how this works in the Google stack is Google has this methodology called consent mode. And consent mode basically gives individual users the ability to sort of opt in or out of tracking. And when users opt into tracking, when they say, yeah, I'm happy to be tracked, I'm happy for you to collect this data so you can optimize my user experience or whatever it is, then fantastic, right? Our measurement tools like Google Analytics basically continue to function as they would have in the past. However, when a user declines consent, this is where you would otherwise be in a situation where, ooh, now we can't track this person's data. I'm going to have data loss. I'm going to have a signal gap, right? So when that happens now, with Google Analytics 4, you automatically get modeled data that is totally custom to your organization, produced through machine learning to replace that otherwise lost data. And so what happens is you end up in a world where basically you have two choices. One is you can basically decide not to use modeled data. And in that environment, you're gonna end up with what you see on the right-hand side of the screen. All of your data will be directly observed, right? There will be no modeled data. And maybe that's kind of your comfort zone, but also your data set will be by definition incomplete and increasingly incomplete, right? Because we know that consent is an increasing factor, right? In more and more cases, we're going to have to get consent. And so what you want to be is in this kind of orange bar in the graph where, yes, you have your directly observed data where possible, right? And you're augmenting it with model data where necessary. Model data can feel like a bit of a black box, right? How does the model work? What are the inputs? Where does this output come from? And all that kind of stuff. But my encouragement to you is Model data is absolutely a part of the future of measurement and analytics and optimization. Right? I think that is undebatable at this point. And so the implication of that is the longer you try to sort of stall adoption of model data, or the more you try to keep it at arm's length, the more you're actually undermining your own ability to compete in the expectations economy, right? And so, what I would encourage instead is, by all means, ask questions, research how these models work, and that kind of thing. But do embrace model data, because this is where the industry is going, and it's going to be just part and parcel of a modern functioning analytics practice over the long term. So the sooner you start and the sooner you get comfortable with this, the better off you're going to be. Okay, now let's talk about experimentation and just going back to basics, like I said earlier. In this environment now where our data isn't as high fidelity as it used to be, it can't be tied to identity in all the same ways that it used to be. It's increasingly anonymous and it's contextual and these kinds of things. It's really important to figure out, what are our clearest, strongest, truest signals, right? How do we actually understand what's working and what's not? And I think this is a message that sometimes gets lost rather, because A/B testing and controlled experiments and these kinds of things are not a new technology. They're not a new methodology. I'm not sitting here today telling you that I've just invented A/B testing, right? This has been around forever, and it long predates the internet even. And so for that reason, I think it kind of gets lost because it isn't the shiny new thing. So my message here is, let's get back to basics and really embrace the importance of this, because in this era now, right, where we have signal loss and where we have to deal with kind of fuzzier data, right, some of which is modeled and not directly observed, we have to have a crystal clear signal that tells us this is what's working and this is what's not. And controlled experiments, the scientific method, is the gold standard for getting that signal. Okay. And the good news is that GA4 as a platform is going to equip you as marketers and as optimizers to make testing not just a kind of tactical tool in your tool belt, but rather something that just suffuses your strategy across every channel, right? And part of why that's the case is that you're going to get that model data to complement the directly observed data. So I think the approach here probably doesn't need to be covered in detail, right? But with GA4, you're going to be able to do things like have a control group or a holdback group. You're going to be able to do things like test different landing pages or different ad creative in media platforms and this kind of thing. And then not only report on the performance of those experiments in GA4, that's kind of table stakes, but also you're going to be able to have this sort of orchestration capability across the entire Google marketing platform, right? So this is not just about reporting in Google Analytics. It's actually about having this kind of command and control capability across the GMP writ large, right? So how do you define an audience in Google Analytics and then drop it into SA360 to do some controlled experiments about what kind of ad copy is going to work best, right? Or how do you take that audience from Google Analytics and then personalize experiences using Google Optimize, right? To understand things like which version of this landing page or which version of this checkout flow or whatever the case might be delivers the best performance for this audience. And so, listen, I think a lot of folks that are listening today probably have done a lot of A/B testing over the years. I don't think you're hearing this for the first time and saying, wow, like A/B testing, amazing. When did they come up with this? But having said that, we do need to embrace this and make this just absolutely part and parcel of how we execute across every channel, across all devices, and not have this be a kind of ad hoc sort of tactical technique that we use when it's easy or when it's convenient or when there's enough time or that sort of thing, right? Because again, we're now in an era where we don't have as clear signals as we used to have. Controlled experiments, A/B testing is the gold standard, right? And so when you're not doing that and yet you're making claims about what's working and what's not, you're using evidence, frankly, that's not sort of best practice, that's not gold standard anymore. And I think that's not a situation that any of us probably want to be in. Okay, now let's shift gears and just talk a bit about how do we do all this stuff? How do we consolidate our data, take advantage of model data? How do we apply these experiments in market, but do that in a way that's compliant, right? And so I'll kind of a laundry list of stuff that we can talk about. I'll let you sort of read this slide a little bit, but basically the message here is that with GA4, Google is equipping brands and equipping marketers with a raft of new privacy and compliance-based features that don't exist in the legacy analytics platform. So that's called universal analytics, or GA3 if you want to call it that. And the implication of that is, if you're still using Google Analytics 3 and you haven't yet moved to GA4, that should raise a lot of questions for you about kind of how up to snuff your control over privacy and compliance really is from a data and analytics standpoint, right? So things like the ability to enable and disable certain data collection features, and to do that on a country by country basis in a world now where we know privacy regulations can vary quite a bit from one country to the next, are really important. And that kind of surgical capability to kind of dial up the measurement where you want to and where you can, and then dial up maybe the privacy instead where you need to, is super important in this patchwork quilt of a world that we're in now. In the United States, for example, with GA4, you can even play this game, if you want to call it that, of deploying your privacy settings on a state by state basis, right? So in California or other states that maybe have more aggressive regulation, you dial up the privacy settings. In other areas, and maybe you don't have to do that yet, right? So anyway, take a look at the various things that are on the slide, but a lot of advancements being made from a privacy and compliance standpoint that mean if you're relying on GA4 for measurement, you're in a place now where your privacy and your compliance practices are a lot further along than they otherwise would be. For example, if you were still using Google Analytics 3. I think that's worth thinking about. And on that note, delivering privacy-centric analytics is not just about data collection, right? What data can I collect? Where can I collect it? How do I collect it? And all those kinds of things. That's what we tend to focus on when we talk about kind of privacy and data. But it's not just about data collection. It's also about what you're doing with that data after you've collected it. So things like, how are you using that data that you've collected? And are you giving people the opportunity to remove that data if they don't want you to have it, right? In certain regions around the world, for example, where GDPR is in effect, people have a right to be forgotten, it's often known. And so as a brand, you have to have some kind of capability to remove data from people, even after you collected it with consent and in a compliant way up front. And so again, the good news here in short is that with GA4, you now have substantially enhanced capability to manage not just privacy from a collection standpoint, but from an ongoing usage and even from a removal standpoint. And so I think that's really important for all of us to consider in terms of a holistic approach to compliance with data. Okay, so hopefully what you've seen is, yes, there are a lot of challenges unfolding in the market that are making measurement and analytics a bit more complicated and a bit more challenging, but Google, through GA4, is bringing a lot of solutions to the table to help us grapple with those challenges. So let's go from the kind of 30,000 foot conceptual overview down to like touching grass, right? What does this mean in terms of some use cases and some opportunities that we can all take away? I think the big one, probably not surprising, is there's a lot that you can do around media effectiveness and media performance and media accountability with GA4 at the heart. And so the analogy here is, can you make GA4 the beating heart or the central nervous system of what you're trying to orchestrate across the broader Google marketing platform? So things like activating audiences across the various buying platforms or Google Optimize. Things like delivering significantly more sophisticated approaches to bidding and targeting by doing things like leveraging your data in BigQuery to model out, for example, a propensity score or a lifetime value that you can bid against, as opposed to bidding for impressions or clicks or even for conversion events. We talked about improving media landing pages. And I think probably the most important one that we'll get to is kind of a more holistic, mature understanding of what's working and what's not through the use of data-driven attribution, right? So let's go through each of these in turn. We know that Google Analytics has always been super critical when it comes to this ability to take an audience, define it in the analytics platform, and then activate it in some other Google platform like Ads or Optimize. And this has been enhanced now with GA4 in a couple different ways. One is because GA4 is cross-platform and cross-device by default, you're now going to be able to do things like put retargeting campaigns into market where you're retargeting people on web based on their in-app behaviors. And of course, the opposite is true as well, right? You can retarget, for example, on mobile based on how people behave on desktop. And that's really interesting. That's going to unlock kind of incremental efficiency from your media buys. And then I want to talk about predictive audiences here as well. So we talked about modeled data, but that's not the only way that machine learning and AI is starting to just work out of the box for you in Google Analytics. So with GA4, you have these predictive audiences. And what predictive audiences do, for example, is automatically out of the box identify for you, hey, these are the 10% of your audience members who are the most likely to purchase or the most likely to churn out, for example. And so if you can proactively target those audiences, you can do things like avoid churn proactively as opposed to having to win back churned audience members, right? And so again, this incremental ability to unlock efficiencies, I think, is really exciting. The other thing that you can do with GA4, if you're on the enterprise version specifically, so GA4 360, is you can now stream your data in real time from Google Analytics to Google Cloud. And what that's going to let you do is deliver things like much more intelligent bidding systems, right? So for example, you can model in real time what's the expected lifetime value or what's the propensity score of this user, and then you can bid against that as opposed to bidding against things like a click-through rate or a conversion rate or even a cost per conversion, right? So because you can now stream this data in real time, you can unlock these use cases that probably wouldn't have been possible in the past, right? And so another example of where you can unlock this incremental gain in media efficiency by putting Google Analytics and Google BigQuery together. That's exciting. All right, now here's another example of using Google Analytics with other Google technologies, right? Integrating these tools to unlock capabilities. We talked about Google Analytics plus BigQuery. Here's an example of using Google Analytics with Google Optimize, right? Again, this is the ability just to run things like A/B tests and personalization campaigns on your website so that you're not just optimizing how you bid, who you bid for, where you bid pre-click, right? But you're actually optimizing the user experience post-click for users who click through on ads and are actually now landing on your site or in your app. The revenue gains, the lead gen gains that come from this are really substantial, especially if you make this a systematic practice as opposed to a kind of ad hoc tactic that you use every so often. And so again, a good example of integrating Google Analytics 4 with related Google technologies like Google Optimize in this case. Now let's round this out and talk about attribution a little bit, right? Attribution in and of itself is one of these capabilities that's challenged by things like the loss of third-party cookies. But within the Google ecosystem, at least, we have this capability now in GA4 to move to data-driven attribution by default. So some of you may know that GA3 used last click attribution, which is a really simplistic rules-based approach to attribution. And that's a really, really old, dated approach, frankly. What we want to do is move to an algorithmic or data-driven approach to attribution, and that's exactly what GA4 does. And so what this is going to do is give you a more objective, more accurate, and more accountable view of how your various marketing investments, not only in the Google stack, but even beyond, are working together to drive incremental success for you. And I think the part about this that's really exciting and that everyone should be looking forward to is this last bullet point here. Not only will you get these kind of fractional conversion credits and richer understanding of attribution from a reporting standpoint, but soon with GA4, you're going to be able to activate directly on the insights that you get from DDA by bidding against fractional conversion credits in the buying platforms themselves. Now, that sounds kind of technical, a little bit down in the weeds, but what you're getting at there is a kind of fully automated closed loop of feedback where up front, you get this more accurate view of what's working and what's not. And then seamlessly, you then use those insights to then bid in the platforms to optimize your media spend and make it run that much more efficiently, right? So automated closed loop of feedback powered by data-driven attribution in GA4. And then lastly, just want to touch on, again, this idea of using Google Cloud. The possibilities here are endless. So just a few bullet points here for inspiration. If you want to do things like create next best action models or propensity scoring or forecasting models, again, you can stream your Google Analytics data into BigQuery now in real time if you're on the enterprise product. And you can still do it within hours of data freshness, even on the free product. You can also augment GA data with your own first-party data, so CRM records, point of sale, all that good stuff. And then you can use that to be building these customized models for the purposes of all different kinds of activations, right? So again, don't just think about Google Analytics as a solution to some of these challenges, but think about the sort of integrated Google, MarTech, and AdTech stack more holistically as well. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground. Let's do just a quick recap, and then we'll close it out. So I think what we saw today was we started off with a lot of kind of important challenges that we need to be able to grapple with if we want to continue to deliver on consumer expectations, right? So those are continental drift, signal loss, and then privacy and compliance. The good news, though, is that while GA4 is not a silver bullet or a magic wand or a cure all, GA4 does bring significant solutions to the table to help us grapple with these challenges, right? So, to combat this idea of fragmentation or continental drift, we're going to move toward data consolidation. To combat signal loss, we're going to rely more heavily on modeled data. And we're going to go back to basics and get that clear signal that you can only get from the scientific method. When it comes to privacy and compliance, the good news is that GA4 equips us with significantly richer capabilities to manage that, right? And what that does is it unlocks some interesting use cases, right? So as you consolidate that first party data in GA4, the activations that you can put in market across the GMP more broadly, right? The full Google marketing platform are going to be a lot more impactful. If you take advantage of model data, if you get rigorous in terms of your use of experimentation, you're going to still have accurate, meaningful, decision driving measurement, even in the face of signal loss. And lastly, you're going to be able to do all of that in a more privacy safe manner than ever before by taking advantage of these new capabilities that Google is equipping you with through GA4. So a lot to think about, a lot of challenges to grapple with. Again, I'm not saying that Google Analytics 4 is like the perfect solution or a set it and forget it kind of solution. But if you're thinking, wow, this is a lot to wrestle with, the good news is that GA4 is bringing a lot to the table. And organizations that adopt these solutions sooner are going to have a competitive advantage over the sort of medium to long term. So that brings us to a conclusion. I hope that everyone's enjoyed this keynote and the conference more generally, and we look forward to seeing you again next time. Thanks, everyone.